Thank you very much. It's a very nice, warm welcome. I was a bit worried when I arrived at Paddington this evening that I was going to be rained off again, but happily, it was just the wind and stuff getting me here, so that's all right. And delighted to be here this evening. This is meeting number, I think it's 38 out of 42 that I've been doing. So anyone who's been at one of them before, bad luck. So you may, although I do try and stick with the most topical things going on at the moment, although that's difficult because there is such a lot of complete craziness going on at the moment. It is almost impossible to keep up with just what that amounts to and what the implications are and what the links are between all these different bits of craziness happening at the moment. Just bear in mind that one quote, "Those whom the gods destroy, they first make mad." Now, I spent a lot of my time thinking, is that person evil or is that person mad? Or is that person completely tied up in a way of thinking, acting, believing that is so deeply committed to undermining the life support systems of this planet that they don't really care what happens elsewhere? And as I followed diligently, as you would expect me to do, all the proceedings going on at COP30 in Brazil, the most recent of these collective outbreaks of surreal insanity that come at the end of every year, I was very struck by just how intense this insanity has now become at these conferences of the parties. And I'm only going to mention two examples which you probably haven't heard about, because they definitely didn't feature very much in the global media about Belém. The first is what was universally described as the good news emerging out of COP30 in Belém, that we are headed to a 2.5 degrees centigrade average temperature increase by the end of this century. That is good news, apparently. And what makes it good news is that 10 years ago, at the time of the Paris Agreement, the COP, whatever it was, in Paris 10 years ago, we were headed for a 4 degrees centigrade temperature increase. So obviously the fact now that we're only headed towards 2.5 degrees by the end of the century has to be good news, as in things are moving in the right direction. Nobody took time out at that point to explain that at 2.5 degrees centigrade average temperature increase by the end of the century, pretty much every single aspect of what we come to call human civilization will either have been devastated as a consequence of accelerating climate impacts, or we will have found some accommodation with the realities, the physical realities of our world today. And we will have, obviously, then found a very different pattern of life for the 8.5 billion, somewhere between 8.5 and 10 billion people with whom we share this planet at the moment. 2.5 is so appalling a prospect for humankind as to beg a belief. And when we get to the point where people describe that as good news, you kind of know that we're deep, deep, deep into this form of insanity. The trouble with a lot of these conferences is that people at them sound so reasonable. So my second example, which you'll be hard put to find any exception with, you know all the fuss that went on at COP26 when we were hosts of this conference of the parties in Glasgow 4 years ago, big song and dance. Remember Boris Johnson in all his, at that time, still kind of pro-climate enthusiasm, blustering away, came up with this little slogan that everybody rather loved. He was quite good at slogans, don't forget. And his slogan for Glasgow was, "Keep 1.5 alive." Keep 1.5 alive. That was the lesser of the two possible temperature increases agreed in Paris in 2015. So theoretically, the entire UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is still geared towards restricting the average temperature increase to below 1.5 degrees centigrade. That's basically the deal still, if you listen to the politicians. The guy who's in charge of the Framework Convention, so he actually has responsibility for delivering the process behind the convention, right at the end of the conference on the final day said this: "We can and we must bring temperatures back down to 1.5 degrees centigrade after any temporary overshoot." Now, does that not sound completely reasonable? Of course it does. Sounds completely reasonable. We're only at 1.23 degrees centigrade at the moment, heading pretty rapidly, I'm sorry to tell you, towards 1.5. May well get, in fact, nearly certain that we will be at 1.5 by 2030. But here is the top UN civil servant, the guy who has primary responsibility, reporting to Guterres, Secretary General of the UN, telling us we can and must bring temperatures back down to 1.5 after any temporary overshoot. Now hang on to that terminology, because again, it tells you how far beyond what the scientists are telling us we've moved. We really don't care about the science anymore. We pay lip service to it. Politicians occasionally acknowledge that the science is very disturbing, but when they all get together in a place like Belém in Brazil or Glasgow, whenever it might be, all of that is pretty much set aside. But this is now the standard get-out clause. Yes, we're going to exceed 1.5 degrees centigrade. Yes, that means it's going to be pretty hellish for humankind. Yes, we will almost certainly exceed 2 degrees centigrade and possibly 2.5 degrees centigrade. But don't worry, we have a plan. And the plan is to get back. So here we are, wherever, 2.5, should we say? The plan is, having got there, temporary overshoot, we're going to get back down below 1.5 degrees centigrade. I need you to know how completely insane this world has become. There is no bringing average temperature increases back down to the point where they were at a certain point, because what it means is sucking billions and billions of tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere. Really? It'd be much more sensible, as everybody points out, to stop putting the billions of tons up there in the first place. But that we can't possibly do, because that would, of course, mean an end to the incumbency of the fossil fuel industry, its total dominance of the global economy, its ability to buy politicians, corrupt the entire body politic in the way that we've seen really over the last 40 or 50 years. So this is not really a good prospect. And when I was writing the book with 26 of Just Stop Oil's younger campaigners, there are many Just Stop Oil campaigners, as you know. Some of them are here this evening. I chose to work with the younger campaigners, as that was my focus at the time, was the notion of intergenerational justice, what oldies like me still have an obligation to help make happen for young people today. And as I started to interview them and started to understand motivation and began to think through what we need to do together, intergenerationally, young and old. Please don't feel left out if you're somewhere in the middle. It's okay, you still have a really crucial role to play, but I'm just at the moment going for the young and the old tie-up, as it were. The thing that absolutely struck me about how they saw this craziness was they didn't really blame the politicians in as much as I thought they would. In fact, they were remarkably tolerant about political failure. Remarkably tolerant. Unlike me, who obviously was not tolerant, having been at it for 50 years, I'm entitled to be a bit intolerant. So that word in the middle there, anger, that's mostly me. They were remarkably loath to dig down into anger, frustration, yes. Fear about the future, yes. What they call anticipatory grief at the consequences for hundreds of millions of people who've done literally nothing to cause this crisis in poorer parts of the world, and an astonishing depth of love. This compassionate reaching out to imagine, to step into the shoes of all of those people in other parts of the world whose lives will now, unfortunately, irreversibly be subject to terrible pain and trauma. And that love was much more important to them than the anger that they might have expressed about political failure. But the one thing that did really piss them off was the fact that it doesn't have to be like this. We don't necessarily have solutions to literally everything that organizing an ultra-low carbon, compassionate, just, decent society would look like. We haven't yet got all the solutions to that, but we've got a set of incredible solutions now which weren't available to us 10 years ago, let alone 20, let alone 50 years ago. But we have a whole suite of really important changes to the way in which we generate, distribute, and use energy. Now, we don't yet have a whole suite of ways in which we create and distribute wealth. That's a bit of a difficult story. We were talking about the pernicious role of 3,028 billionaires in the world today. We may well come back to that in a bit. But just stick with the technology bit for a moment. And please understand, I'm really not a techie type. I am not a techno fixer. I have spent most of my life deeply suspicious of techno fixers because very often they want to fix it by technology, forget the rest. Okay, we'll fix it by technology. What about the 3,028 billionaires? It doesn't really matter. You know, that's okay. What about the fact that we're reverting to insane militarism all over again, with the US defense budget next year rising to $1 trillion? Should we worry about, well, look, don't worry, we've got the technology to do a lot of this stuff, so just stick with the technology. People like that, they make me quite angsty, I must admit. But we shouldn't turn our back on what the revolution looks like from the point of view of renewable energy today. And there was an astonishing bit of, I have to say this, real good news at the end of last week when the International Energy Agency came out with its latest assessment for what will happen to investment into energy systems through 2025, and came out with a preliminary calculation that somewhere between 80 and 90% of all new investment in all new capacity, so any energy system, coal, gas, nuclear, hydro, renewables, the whole lot, between 80 and 90% will go to renewables and storage technologies. What is happening, of course, is genuinely a revolution. And these technologies are getting cheaper, they're getting more efficient, they're getting more useful for people in poorer countries as well as richer countries. And it isn't just the technology. It's the social innovation that goes with it. So their anger on that score would have been massively amplified 3 weeks ago, where we heard from Australia. This is a case study I've completely fallen in love with, okay? Australia's not really a massively effective climate champion. They've got as much coal as they could go on burning for hundreds of years, et cetera, et cetera. They've always been a bit muddled about climate change, but then which country hasn't? But, of course, you will know that Australia has a lot of sunshine. And over the course of the last 20 years, Australians have been fitting these solar cells to their roofs because it makes a great deal of sense. So much so that for a little bit of time in the middle of every day, between about 11 and 2 o'clock, as the sunshine beats down on all these solar panels, the wholesale price of electricity, when demand is quite low, falls to zero. It has no value because nobody's using it, because it's just there. So Albanese, Prime Minister of Australia, not a climate champion, but a smart cookie in some respects, decided he would turn this into a bit of social innovation, which I offer you this evening as a marker for the revolution to come. So Albanese said, fine, every single Australian citizen can have 3 hours of completely cost-free electricity every day. You won't have to pay anything for it. So your tariff on a daily basis might start quite high at 6 o'clock in the morning when everyone's getting up, doing the things they do, truck along quite high at start, come 11 o'clock, boom, down it goes to zero, stays at zero for 3 hours, starts rising again, peak tariffs back again at 5, 6, 7, 8 o'clock in the evening, because Aussies obviously have a quite carbon-intensive lifestyle still, if the truth be told. Everybody thought, well, that sounds good. Where are we going to do our next big shop? We're going to nip down to the store and we're going to buy ourselves one of these natty little home batteries, which you can stick on the side of your house, not a Tesla home battery, because they don't like Elon Musk that much in Australia either. We'll stick it on, come our free 3 hours, we'll charge up our battery for nothing. Come peak tariff prices at 6, 7 o'clock in the evening, we'll download everything we need from our battery because we don't be paying anything, and we'll do it again the next day, and the next day, and the next day, forever, indefinitely into the future. Just give you a tiny little insight into why the fossil fuel industry and why all rampant neoliberal capitalists hate solar so much. Hate it because it takes away the biggest profit streams that exist in the world today. They just go. Once you've got that much sunshine and you've paid your capital costs of solar cells, which are very, very cheap, the rest comes for free. So you won't be surprised to know that the National Party, the right-wing party, a bit like Labour here in the UK, instantly decided that Albanese should from here on in be known as a solar communist. Now, it's a bit of political cut and thrust, but think about it for a moment. There's a genuine revolutionary seed being sown here. And it tells us something, not about the technology of solar power, but about the social innovation and the potential shift which allows us to create the basis for all economics, rich and poor countries, in a way that nobody had properly thought through 5, 10, 15 years ago. I don't know what will happen to that. Gavin Newsom, governor of California, has already said, we've got almost as much sunshine as Australia. There's no reason why we shouldn't do this. I'm going to go back. He was in Brazil as well. I'm going to go straight back to California, and I'm going to ask my officials to work out what we need to do to get a similar system for free solar power for every citizen of California for a given number of hours every day. California is the 4th largest economy in the world. A bigger economy than us. The 4th largest economy. So you can understand why, if you're a young campaigner today, and you can see the damage that is being done to people today and to prospects of all people tomorrow, and politicians still tell you, as a young person in your 20s, that, quotes, there is no alternative, it's fossil fuels or the lights go out, you can understand why that would focus your mind on the need to bring as much political focus and action as is possible, to shift them into a place where instead of this crabby, grudging acknowledgement that renewables are very important to the future of this and every other country, and to be fair to Ed Miliband, and I do like to be fair to Ed Miliband because you've got to be fair to at least one person in a government as absolutely fantastically useless as this one, to be fair to Ed Miliband, he totally gets this story about revolutionizing the supply side of the system. He doesn't get the revolutionizing the demand bit. So if we put energy efficiency as our first thing to invest in, and then renewables, that would be so radical that it's almost unimaginable. And he's got lots of crazy bees in his bonnet. He actually thinks that nuclear power is going to make a bit of a difference to the way in which we generate zero carbon electricity for the future. If anybody wants to own up to that particular insanity later on, very happy to deal with it in Q&A. I can get a bit ratty about that, though. So we need to understand this is not just trying to stop the really bad stuff that is happening. Much of the campaigning work that needs to be done in the future is to make this alternative vision of what a better energy system underpinning a better economy, underpinning a better society would actually look like. You have to start there. Without that, it's very hard to build the wider prospect for a better society, as I've just said. But it's really not easy to do this. We have a government that is absolutely obsessed about growth. I don't mean growth, I mean growth, growth, growth. Because as you know, neither Keir Starmer nor Rachel Reeves can help themselves. When they mention the word growth once, they have to mention it 3 times. Otherwise, it's not the mantra, this religious dogma that nothing else happens without growth. The mantra doesn't work unless you say it 3 times. So if you want to ask me a question about growth later on, please follow the mantra and ask me what I think about growth, 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 which I think most people today recognize that though growth still creates huge benefits for some people, most of those benefits are going to make the already super rich even richer, and most of the disbenefits are now falling on the shoulders of those least able to cope with that additional burden. How do we challenge this dominance of economic growth? It is genuinely a really big political challenge. Which means we have to think about the politics of this, and I just want to say in passing that we are seeing some astonishingly exciting social tipping points beginning to emerge in our lives. Scientists today are obviously very focused on physical tipping points. I'm sure you all know what scientists mean when they talk about tipping points. Every single large physical ecosystem-based part of the natural world is subject to either being completely stable or becoming unstable or getting close to the point of tipping or actually tipping. Throughout the Anthropocene period, which is the period of time that we human beings have lived in relative climatic comfort for tens of thousands of years, throughout that period, most of these systems were completely stable. And it wasn't until we started pumping the greenhouse gases into the atmosphere at the start of the Industrial Revolution that we began to see a shift in some of those systems. So much so that some began to demonstrate less stability, even 40 or 50 years ago. And now that we've kept on pumping those greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, 40 billion tons every year, some of those systems are looking very unstable. And scientists now tell us that some could easily tip within the course of the next few decades. Sooner, maybe. Coral reefs are almost gone anyway, as a consequence of warming ocean temperatures, what are called marine heat waves sweeping through today's ocean systems with devastating impact on coral reefs. That's the physical side. Question mark, to cheer you up. Do you think there's the equivalent social tipping point moments which would be proportionate to, commensurate with those physical tipping points. Can you in your own mind think of something which would need to tip socially, economically, to have the same astonishing effect on our system, our human systems, as some of these impacts of climate change on physical systems will have? It's quite a big ask, isn't it? It is probably the point where you begin to think about revolutionary stuff. Because if we're going to tip this system, it is going to have to tip in such a way that we challenge the dominance of a particular class of very rich people in society, and we do so in a way to achieve a much fairer, more equitable economy. Every system eventually tips. So I often ask people, where are they in their own mind when it comes to thinking about socioeconomic systems tipping? Do you think we've reached peak billionaire greed? So it can't get any worse? Are we sort of right at the top of that utterly insane, pathological approach to wealth creation? Are we at the point of peak kleptocracy? Or have we still got some way to travel? And it is, of course, quite difficult to give the right kind of answer with Donald Trump still in the White House, given that he epitomizes everything that is awful about that pattern of exploitation and extracting wealth from other people. I came across a very interesting definition of kleptocracy yesterday, and I thought, does this sound familiar? Kleptocracy is now rampant across the entire world. It represents a system of corruption in which a network of ruling elites use the institutions of government to steal public assets for their own private gain. So basically, the super rich already corrupting a pretty weak system in order to use government, the institutions of government, to take those assets and to commandeer those assets for private gain to the detriment of the public good. And we do now have, essentially, a kleptocratic global economy, and we certainly have a rampant kleptocracy in the United States. I don't think we can turn away from that reality, so sanity is probably going to depend to a certain extent on what American voters can do in the middle of next year. God help us if we don't see something of a change to that particularly pernicious elite going on there. Finally, what does that mean for all of us? These are huge, ridiculously huge factors to cope with. They're not just global, but they seem to be out of reach of most of us as citizens trying to do our bit to create better conditions for people today. So global and out of reach, and that's the worst combination because, of course, it makes people feel more and more powerless when we think about what we need to do to address it. For me, the story of Just Stop Oil is a simple one. It is basically about an organization that refused to accept that powerlessness, refused to settle for the government justifications for continuing with the dependence on fossil fuels, and decided to use civil disobedience, nonviolent direct action, to shake politicians and people out of that complacency, and to do it by attention-grabbing tactics of one kind or another, which obviously proved to be extremely controversial. One can't deny that. For many people, Just Stop Oil's tactics as well as Insulate Britain that came before them, and for some even the tactics of Extinction Rebellion, were controversial, were provocative, in that they forced people to think through what their own particular theory of change might be to end up with a better, more climate-attuned economy. You all know the story of this now. After 3 years, the government, to begin with, the Tory government, introduced two increasingly onerous new bits of legislation: the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act in 2022, and then the Public Order Act in 2023. And many people in Just Stop Oil are still facing the consequences of their arrests particularly under the Public Order Act, Section 7. The consequence of being arrested, and those playing out now for at least the next 2 years. Some have had their trials postponed until the end of 27 and possibly into 2028. Just chatting at the start, we thought to ourselves, we sort of hoped that Labour might look at this again, review it a bit, and see whether this kind of authoritarian imposition was compatible with, quotes, Labour values, quotes. That unfortunately didn't happen. As you know, indeed, they have been pushing and still are pushing even further down the path to a more authoritarian approach to the right to protest here in the UK. On some of the chairs today, I put out a little leaflet from the wonderful Trudy Warner, and I'm sure Trudy's name will resonate with a lot of you as the voice, to begin with, of the principle of jury equity. Going back to the trial in 1670, this is Britain, this is England after all, so we've got to have a crazy historical story to tell. But going all the way back to 1670, when a judge at that stage instructed a jury to find two Quaker preachers guilty of whatever offense they'd cooked up, and the jury refused to do it, and they were told to do it again, they refused to do it, so that judge, master of his own courtroom, of course, decided to imprison them for not doing what the judge said. And out of that came the principle of jury equity, that all jurors have an absolute right to determine their judgment on a defendant according to their conscience, not according to what the judge tells them. And astonishingly, this Thursday, outside the Royal Courts, there will be a crazy moment in English law where a judge called Silas Reed, who was one of the first and most draconian of the judges in dealing with Insulate Britain and Just Stop Oil protesters, Silas Reed is going to be informally on trial himself for one of the comments that he made in a trial of Insulate Britain protesters, where he told the jurors in his court that they would be breaking the law if they made their decision, gave their verdict according to their conscience. This is like hundreds and hundreds of years of historical precedent, of an understanding of what the rule of law means, both outside the judicial process and inside the judicial process. And what we now know, especially given the campaign to lift the ban on an organization called Palestine Action, prescribed by this government as a terrorist organization, what we know now is this government has no compunction whatsoever in using every single power to crush whatever form of protest it might be that cuts across their view of what these rights look like in the UK today. And the reason for this is very simple. Palestine Action is not a terrorist organization. The clause of the Terrorism Act that is being used by the government, which is to cause severe damage to property, was never intended to go after direct action organizations like Palestine Action, but because the government could not crush Palestine Action in any other way, they decided to prescribe it as a terrorist organization, which is now We've seen more than 2,500 arrests of people for holding up an extremely simple sign: I oppose genocide, I support Palestine action. And I feel particularly privileged to be part of that line of defense when it comes to protecting basic human rights here in the UK. What does it mean for climate campaigners? Oh. When Just Stop Oil started out in 2022, stepping into the road, slow marching, blocking a bit of traffic, yeah, it would have been a nuisance. You would have been arrested. You would have faced legal sanctions. You would have probably had a court case. You definitely would have got a sentence. It probably would have been suspended. It might have been a community sentence. You would have had a fine. You definitely wouldn't have been banged up for 2, 3, or even 4 years. So the government has shifted the power here in the UK to make it harder and harder, particularly, I think, for young people to take the kind of actions which it was possible to take back in 2022. So just a thought for us this evening. We're going to move into some Q&A now. Just a thought: how do we, as concerned citizens, about the climate crisis, about justice, about equity, about basic human rights, freedom of speech, freedom to assemble, freedom to protest, what is the responsibility of us now in a country that has changed almost out of all recognition over the course of the last 5 years? In a way that I think still astonishes people when you look at it. You do a before and after story, and if you're not shocked by what has happened during that time, well, you need to go and read it again, because you bloody well should be. It is genuinely shocking. So just a thought for ideas for this evening, to share this evening. Love to hear from you about any ideas, what it means for all of us. Now, still, I hope, acknowledging the importance of civil disobedience as part and parcel of the spectrum of campaigning tactics. At one end, everything being very safe and not particularly threatening, and tick the odd box here and write the odd letter there and turn up on a march if you're lucky. By the way, that excludes Palestine solidarity marches, which remain utterly astonishing. And the one at this weekend, another incredible, I think it's 34 now. But that spectrum goes all the way down to civil disobedience, non-violent, peaceful, direct action. Where are we going to make things work in that spectrum of protest in the future? Right, that's me done. Thank you. Perfect. There's a guy over there, right there.
It's great to see that you've taken a bit of a shift to youth-led movements, to protests that focus around young people. What role do you think that people in this audience and older people, older activists generally, what role do they have in supporting youth-led movements, and how important are they?
Yeah, I've thought about that a lot, obviously. I started life as a teacher, taught in a comprehensive school in the west of London for 10 years. I've been passionate about what we need to do to make things work for young people, whatever circumstances they're born into, and whatever fate hands out to them, to support them and sometimes to do them down. And that has stuck with me for 50 years. And what I know now is that although we once took it for granted, the concept of intergenerational justice meant very simply that older generations would do everything that they had to do not to screw things up for all future generations, the next one, and then generations after that. That was the concept of intergenerational justice at the heart of sustainable development, Brundtland Report, and all that. That is the basic understanding of intergenerational justice, which has now been simply swept aside. And collectively, and please don't misinterpret this, I'm not making this a kind of censorious comment about any individual, but collectively, older generations live their lives today in the full knowledge that this is diminishing the life chances and expectations of all future generations. You can't not have that knowledge in your mind. You can't. It's impossible. You can't talk about a temperature increase of 2.5 degrees centigrade without understanding what that means for future generations. You can't talk about the astonishing attack on nature going on at the moment, with 1 million species at risk of extinction and terrible damage being done to the natural world at every turn. We can't talk about basics of social justice when you look at what the malign role of 3,028 billionaires is. So we do know what intergenerational injustice now looks like. So that's why I raised the question about what does that mean for us. I don't have a kind of simple answer to the question, what does it mean for everybody here? I know that it doesn't mean everybody has to go out and instantly glue themselves to the road outside in a sort of mass outbreak of craziness. It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean to say that everybody has to have a theory of change that dismisses anything that's happening in the mainstream. Admittedly, most of my co-authors, the people they were most critical of were mainstream environmentalists. Not because they have a different theory of change from Just Stop Oil, but because they did not support the use of those tactics as well as all those more conventional mainstream tactics. That's the thing that got them. They couldn't understand it when WWF and RSPB and the Wildlife Trust would go out of their way to criticize what was happening through Just Stop Oil on the grounds that this alienated people rather than bringing them to the cause, as it were. So I don't know what it means for people. There are many, many ways of helping young people today. Many ways. And I just urge you to think about whatever organizations you're working with and for and through, and at the community level, what does it mean? What does it mean at the community level to provide chances for young people to express themselves about their concern about the future? All of these things are really important parts of the total picture. So I'm conscious that we're here with XR banners behind us, which reminds us, of course, of the wonderful 2018 explosion, often of youth-led radical enthusiasm, the strikes for Friday. And let me take you back to that extraordinary moment of Greta Thunberg holding up her sign as one single young woman protesting outside the Swedish Parliament, school strike for the climate. And it went from one person, as you know, to more than 6 million people protesting about the climate crisis in the course of 15 months. Probably the most extraordinary social movement we've seen. So don't forget that amazing energy that young people brought to bear on this. It was just, for oldies like me, it was intoxicating to think about the ways in which that energy could be harnessed to all the grizzled, experienced stuff that we like to think might still be relevant. I like to think it'll still be relevant, but God knows. Do you have any ideas?
Well, yeah, like I said, if older people listen to younger people in the sense that they know what you've lived and then finding their way to support them in whichever ways they can, rather than expecting younger people to come to their movements, instead older people moving into spaces where younger movements are happening would, I think, help that with what you were just saying.
Thank you. I agree. There's one here. Yeah, boing.
Thank you. I was at the National Emergency Briefing on Thursday in Parliament, Westminster Hall last week, and you had a panel of 10 amazing experts just sharing the facts of the enormity of the crisis that we're all facing.
Yeah.
And the whole of that event is predicated on the basis that you can still use science and facts to change politicians' minds so that they will do something different. Do you think that is still an avenue for change, or do you think we're so far beyond that that nothing short of a revolution will now do?
Very good question. I don't think, unfortunately, that we would be wise to depend too much on the automatic assumption that science and rationality is now sufficient to change the way in which politics responds to these crises. I don't think there's enough evidence to bear out that hypothesis. They have found incredibly effective ways, not of dismissing the science any longer, but just, no, we get it, but we're not going to do anything about it. It's denial of a different kind. It's not denial of the science. It's denial of the implications of the science, which is so deeply dangerous today. So here's a little quote from last week, just to see what you think about this. This is a president of a country who I am expecting you to be able to name. We no longer have any choice in this matter. We simply have to move our capital city. Lock, stock, and barrel. That is, by the way, an English translation probably means very different in the original language, but anyway. It is now a binding obligation on us as leaders of the country now, as our capital city faces complete catastrophe and a very dark future. Ignoring the science of what this tells us means signing our own destruction. President of which country? Iran. Not the first country, by the way, to have to think about moving its capital city, because Indonesia has had to move its capital city. Slightly different problem in Jakarta, which is that the city's sinking, the sea levels are rising, and between these two, sinking and rising, not a happy prospect. So they've moved their capital to a city called Nusantara somewhere in Java. People don't like it and they don't want to leave Jakarta. Of course they don't want to leave Jakarta. And no more will they want to leave Tehran. 15 million people now being told they'll have to move because there is no water. Because they've so inefficiently managed their water for agriculture. And they've so inefficiently managed the use of water in an urban environment. And they've been so shocked by the speed with which climate-induced drought and long periods of no rain in periods where they've previously had very, reasonably high levels of precipitation, it's taken the system completely by surprise. Now, I use the example of Tehran, probably because you're thinking, okay, it's Tehran, that's a bit tricky. We don't know whether we should feel really good about that or really bad about that. Bit of a poser, eh? But just think about this from the point of view of what it tells us about urban living in the future. And this is a long-winded way of answering your question. I don't think we can rely on science to shift the minds of politicians. But I do absolutely believe that we can count on real climate-induced shocks to the system converting into multi-billion-dollar economic impacts on a gathering basis year after year to shift the minds of investors and capital markets and the insurance industry. Unfortunately, Belém in Brazil was stuffed full of representatives of the fossil fuel industries and equally upsetting now of big ag. These big agricultural companies now are as powerful and, in my opinion, as deeply, deeply immoral as the fossil fuel companies. The number of representatives from the insurance sector was apparently tiny. And I thought, well, that's a bit weird. Because you guys in the insurance sector and the reinsurance sector, you are now on the front line of how quickly we change our assumption of costs and benefits in the global economy. So look to the insurance industry, because I think there's some really interesting stuff going on there. And just as soon as a senior executive leaves the insurance industry, they say the things that they never dare to say when they're in those bloody insurance companies in the first place, because they're all, as we know, deeply hypocritical, overpaid parts of the incumbency. So here's a guy called Gunther Tallinger, former chief executive of Allianz Investment. Don't feel any moment's sympathy for Allianz. It's a ghastly country supporting the genocide in Gaza and doing tons of terrible stuff. But Gunther, in his wisdom, when he got out of Allianz, had this to say. At 2.5 degrees centigrade, remember we were having a bit of a thing about 2.5? At 2.5 degrees centigrade of global heating in the second half of this century, climate damage can no longer be insured against. It cannot be covered by government systems, and it cannot be adapted to. That means no more mortgages, no new real estate development, no long-term investment in capital markets, probably no pensions, and certainly no financial stability. Woo. Which means the financial sector as we know it today ceases to function, and with it, capitalism as we know it today ceases to be viable. Yay. Now, you rather wish that he'd said that while he was chief executive of Allianz Investment, but we all know what would have happened. He would not have been chief executive of Allianz Investment for very much longer. He would have been out on his ear the day after he gave voice to such truthful words. So are we going to see capital markets being more responsive to science, empirical science, as in measured impacts on the ground, real-time measure? You're watching these floods, I hope, in Southeast Asia at the moment. Oh my God, more than 1,000 dead now already. Combination of monsoons plus extreme storms coming in off superheated oceans. And this is just the latest, and we'll probably get one of these a week from now on. So my joker in the pack is the insurance industry. That keeps me from despair, okay? There's a hand there, and you're looking quite cheerful as well. That's good.
Yes, I don't claim to know any solutions, but people being what they are, and politicians being who they are, and governance being what it is, there is something on TED Talks, and I don't know if you've ever heard of this guy, Akshat Rathi, who's got a TED Talk called Climate Capitalism, offering solutions to the climate crisis. Never heard of him, never heard the talk, but it is something that somebody sent me, and I don't know if you come across this term.
Oh, yes. Yes. I don't think you need to spend too much time on it unless you enjoy the surreal. I mean, let's be honest about climate capitalism, because look, I don't know if I feel comfortable about suggesting, with all my political experience over 50 years, that we're just going to get to the edge of the abyss, then we're going to have the revolution, then we'll draw back from the abyss. Doesn't seem to me to be a kind of cast iron scenario for the future. So I do not blame a lot of people today for thinking about ways of navigating out of the intense crisis today by emphasizing different areas of so-called green growth. And so-called green growth means no fossil fuels, but massive investments in renewables, efficiency, storage, grids, etc. It means, it gets a little bit harder than that, it does not mean swapping out every internal combustion engine for one new electric vehicle, because to produce 1.6 billion electric vehicles to substitute for the 1.6 billion petrol and diesel vehicles we have would mean mining the world. So should you by any chance have any friends, colleagues, or whatever it might be, members of your own family, who really expect to be congratulated at having exited the world of fossil fuels and have got a shiny new EV with its little green badge parked ostentatiously just outside, and they go and buff it up a bit every day, and they're waiting for you to pat them on the head, don't. Get the finger out and say, well, okay, you probably had to do that. Possibly. Did you really need to have a car? But anyway, the answer to this is, of course, we don't depend on cars at all. We move towards transport systems in which we have car sharing schemes, public transport, much better public transport, cycling, opportunities for people to walk, etc., etc. And that is a better answer, but not quite so capitalistic. Guess why? Because 1.6 billion EVs, whoopee! Tons of profit. Car sharing schemes, where 10 cars do the job for 100 people instead of 100 EVs. No, that's not good. It's not capitalism as we know it, where we maximize growth potential. So look, I understand why people are nervous about revolutionary ways forward, because that's scary. And can we possibly find ways of using green growth to cope with some of the intense pressures today? I don't know. But that it's so bad because I'd never heard of this guy, but I'm just going to absolutely trash him, which is so awful. And it might be the most brilliant TEDx talk that you've ever seen. Most of the people who are bigging up climate capitalism today are people who are into geoengineering. Okay, so we've lost 1.5. We're probably going to lose 2. We'll go to 2.5. What's the solution to that? We get things back. Remember? Back down under 1.5. And how do we do that? We geoengineer the shit out of what's left of the planet. So we have withdrawal systems to suck down billions of tons of CO2. We mess around with the atmosphere where we put aerosols so that it bounces more of the incoming solar radiation off into space. If you're Elon Musk inclined, God, I hope you're not, but if you are, we probably think about putting massive great solar panels in outer space to beam concentrated solar power back down onto Earth. If that doesn't fail, well, we bugger off to Mars. But all of these people have one simple thing. We've messed the planet up. We know that. The reason why we're not worried, as the super rich, is we think we can fix it using all the power of capitalism today. That's what they're thinking. And if you're someone like Mark Zuckerberg, Peter Thiel, all these other horror stories, they think they can create refuges where they will be free of the breakdown affecting 99.999% of humankind as they hang on in their multi-million-dollar bunkers. Did I start by thinking about insanity? I think I did, didn't I? So geoengineering, watch out for untold controversies, scams, all sorts of things which we just have to expect in the future. There is some brilliant geoengineering, by the way, if you really want some exciting stuff, which is to do with nature, to do with restoring shattered natural systems in the marine environment and on land. And the thing that I've read about most recently, which I have to admit to being quite excited about, is hemp. I had a hemp moment over the weekend. Don't worry, not that kind of hemp moment, okay. Where I read about the astonishing potential of hemp amongst so many other terrestrial plants, trees and fast-growing willows and other bits of biomass. Hemp, boy, oh boy, it sucks up the CO2 faster than practically anything you can imagine. It's hardy as hell. You don't need to apply chemicals to it. It's got other properties, which may or may not be helpful to humankind. It makes wonderful building materials, like insulation materials, and according to this lovely, slightly crazy, not totally insane, slightly crazy projection, could help us suck 2 billion tons of CO2 back out of the atmosphere, as long as we get planting. So geoengineering, keep your eyes on that. Probably the next wave of problems with 1 or 2 good things along the way. And then I'll come to you at the back, then come to you.
It's lovely to hear your optimism, Jonathan, because I think it's so important, and it's easy to get lost in despair sometimes, or I find anyway. But I was just wondering, so your book focused very much on young people, and that's what you were doing with JSO, and having read half of the book. I'm halfway through, and just it was really nice reading, their perspectives, on why they were doing what they were doing and things like that. And I was just wondering, for any young people in the room, it'd just be really nice to hear maybe if you had anything that you wanted to say, because it'd be lovely to hear from you if you did.
But don't feel any pressure. I was hoping, we had a plan that one of my co-authors, an amazing young man called Daniel Knorr, who did his time in prison, and everything you would want a young person to be in terms of reflecting the best of humankind. I was hoping he might be able to come this evening, but unfortunately, he must have got waylaid. He's very excited because he's just out of prison, got a job in a vegan bakery. So he's definitely thinking about there's something beyond prison. Because don't forget, a lot of the young people who were in prison, out of prison now, you don't just drop back into the old pattern. It sticks, a lot of it sticks. And out of the 26, I would say at least 7 or 8 have found it extremely difficult coping with life after prison, as it were. And there's a pattern of burnout that you'll all be familiar with. So it's a tricky story. Can we take that hand there, and then this hand here, and then this hand there?
Hi, Jonathan. Thank you so much. I wondered what you got to say about the crisis in compassion. It seems to be like, because of all the misinformation, because of all the anger, because of all the division in society, you see it all the time on all social media, or, whether it's climate or Palestine or in my case, because I live in Walthamstow, mini Holland, the public transport, the limiting of cars, accentuating public transport. People are so angry and they're so misinformed. And there's just, I was on a Facebook sort of thread trying to explain why protesters in Waltham Forest had asked the council to invest their pensions not in Palestine and not in fossil fuels. And it was so shocking how angry people were, but in completely mad ways, didn't make sense. And somehow I think as communities we have to really tackle that if we're going to make progress with the changes that will come through the changes that climate change brings. And that's a major communications problem, and I just wondered what you thought about that.
Absolutely. And we are inheriting 10, 20 years of a political tone which played upon people's understandable, actually in many cases, understandable anger and frustration, and went in for increasingly sophisticated scapegoating to persuade people that was where they could direct their anger. I'm not here this evening to do a party political talk, I can assure you. I have been a member of the Green Party for 50 years, but I'm not, what I'm going to say now is not because I want to make a kind of cheap comment about the Green Party, but for me, Zach Polanski is now speaking that counter-truth about the importance of compassion. And yes, he's quite cross about a lot of things, I've noticed. Good. But when he talks about the things he's cross about, he's all the time, he's trying to do it in a way that reflects a different kind of feeling and empathy for people today. When he read Benjamin Zephaniah's poem about what it is to be part of a multiracial, very diverse, vibrant society such as we have here in London, in the Midlands, in many parts of the UK. And he chose to read that poem to remind people that the reasons why we need to dig deep into our resources of compassion is because life makes more sense when we treat each other with respect and dignity and love. And I hope Zach sticks to his guns on this, because he is speaking a different language. He's going after Nigel Farage, which is good, but he's not going after Nigel Farage in kind of Nigel Farage, hateful, polemical, rage-inducing cruelty, which is what Nigel Farage stands for, as well as greed and racism. It's a long list. That's not what Zach's doing. He's going after him, but he's not going after Reform voters. He's suggesting that the anger, frustration, despair sometimes that people feel is wholly justified, because we've had 20 years of this neoliberal sucking up of wealth from less well-off and middle-class people into the hands of the super rich. So of course people are angry. So do I think that's a defining characteristic of Zach's leadership? I hope so. I seriously hope so. Zara Sultana speaks with that voice as well. I'm not sure Jeremy Corbyn does quite. Stuck in a bit of an old Labour thingy. Not sure whether they're ever going to live happily together. Cohabitation in your party looks like a particularly complicated form of relationship management. But whatever, there is a new mood on the left of politics here in the UK, which is trying to change the tone about anger and hatred, contempt for others. And boy, I think whatever we do, we really need to be part of that, as you so clearly are in your example in Walthamstow. I mean, I know so many local campaigns where the starting premise is, pick your words with care, reach out to people, put your arms around them metaphorically, and see what that creates in terms of ways of working together more effectively. Very powerful at the local level. But hard work, bloody hard work. We had this one here. Oh, well, I'm not quite, but this guy was first, and then this guy, and then I'm going to take two more together. Then.
Thanks. So much food for thought. There are so many questions I would love to have asked. I'm going to stick to one which actually follows on a bit from the last one. We're facing your point about social and economic revolutions got me thinking about there are so many that need to happen. But I was thinking about one in particular, which is around public opinion. And obviously, public opinion is one of only many things that need to be where we need a social revolution, which is why it links your previous question. The thought I had, it's one of the things we're up against is there's public opinion surveys that show that actually the number of people who don't care about climate change or deny it is actually really quite small, but the number of people who care passionately about it is also fairly small. Most people care moderately about it. And that is the bit that the environment movement hasn't really dealt with, and there's been a reason why the environment movement kind of was wary about the sort of really laying it on thick just how terrible the situation is, because that could be very demotivating. That's there's a whole load of evidence around don't scare people into inaction.
Yeah.
Where do you see that balance? But now, given how much worse the climate crisis is now than sort of when you were in charge of Friends of the Earth 30 years ago, that the science has got so much worse, and we really do need to up the kind of, if we're going to reflect the science, actually it really is quite catastrophic, and yet there is still that risk of scaring people into inertia. How do we strike that balance?
Yeah. I really wrestle with this. You can see my inclination in all of this is to hark back to Extinction Rebellion's first message to everybody: tell the truth. Tell the truth about the climate crisis. Don't soft-soap it. Don't try and, give people phony reassurance about it. People need to know what is unfolding in our midst, what this crisis looks like now, right now, and what the implications are for the future. So I refuse to pull away from that, and I think that everybody has an obligation to be to be real about that story of telling the truth. If you then leave people in the truth, in the pain, in the despondency, in the, oh fuck, oh my God, okay, I give up, and you don't then provide ways through, not out, because we all have to live in that despair. We're all going to go on feeling that anticipatory grief at what's coming now, inevitably, towards us. But we have to find ways of building these alternatives. And for me, that's where I think a lot more emphasis is going to come through at the local level. I have become more and more persuaded that the ways in which we need to speak to each other and build solutions together will work better at the national level than it will at the local level than it will at the national level. You can see politicians are dead scared about trying to persuade voters that life will actually be better with a low carbon, ultra low carbon economy. They've lost the trick of being bold and exciting and visionary about this. And they've particularly given up the ground to the Conservative Party and to Reform, which now commands the right-wing media consensus here that net zero is a massive tax, particularly aimed at poor people. That's the narrative. Unbelievable that we've had such cloth-eared, idiotic politicians that they've allowed that to happen. And that's because they don't dare go out and talk about the benefits that would accrue in community after community. If you may have noticed, I put energy efficiency first. Top of my list of energy efficiency is sorting out the disgusting housing situation in this country where millions of people live in conditions that literally no one should ever be expected to live in. Just Stop Oil never really asked me for advice about strategy, very wise, but the one occasion where they did ask me, they asked me to do a 300-word summary of what I thought the next campaign should be. And in my naivety, I came up with Just Stop Mold. Because I thought, okay, not a lot of people like Just Stop Oil, but if Just Stop Oil decided to go after rogue landlords in both the private and the social housing sphere and used all of their campaigning skills and went for them and never let go of them and shamed them day in, day out, well, I think a lot of people would end up loving Just Stop Oil. Sorry, I was rejected. But I suppose what I'm saying, a bit stupidly, is we have to make this work for people at every level in society. Net zero, Ed Miliband's getting there, has to be about 500,000 new jobs. It has to be about better housing. It has to be about reducing the burden on the NHS, because hundreds of thousands of people are having to go to their GPs time after time after time throughout the year because of respiratory and other health problems, because they're living in such shit housing. So if we do all that stuff, some call that eco-populism, not sure about the terminology myself, but if we do all that stuff, then there may be a better route through from it, telling the narrative, the story about why this is a better world for people. Okay, we got this gentleman here, and then, well, definitely have to come here. I tell you what, I'm going to take, can I just take 2 or 3 here, and then I'll take, there's another little circle over there, and then we'll wrap it up, because, yes.
Okay, thank you very much for this. You talked about repressive new legislation that the Tories brought in, why they brought it in, and why the Labour Party doesn't repeal it or reduce it. One of the reasons in the climate movement, one of the biggest reasons as we see it, I've heard said, is the corporate media and the fear of politicians by being pilloried for repressing such legislation. And I read a lot about that in Donna Chadha McCarthy's book, The Prostitute State, How Britain's Democracy Has Been Bought, and that the corporate media is one of the biggest things that we've got to overcome. So could you comment on that and anything that we could do about that?
Nope. Look, I could probably comment, I could probably go on for 10 minutes, but do you know the percentage of the mainstream media outlets, print, broadcast, social media, that are now controlled by, let's call them the super rich, not necessarily the full-on billionaire class, but with Lord Rothermere about to buy the Telegraph titles? It's another billionaire acquisition, of course. Do you know what the percentage of concentration of media ownership in the hands of the super rich already looks like here in the UK?
I heard 80%.
Somewhere between 75 and 80%. So the reason I can't answer that question is because how are you going to persuade all of them when you've got a completely complicit government that is only too happy to have that level of media concentrated ownership and is now going after the BBC as one of the sole remaining voices of, for me, still truthfulness. They do their best. They may not get it right every time, as we know, but for me, they still do the best. So it's a massive part of the problem. Massive part. Sorry.
We've talked about supply side, you know, the renewables and the potential, and hinted that the demand side is much harder. Politicians hate it. Any idea of anybody changes their lifestyle. We're all going to do long-haul flights with sustainable aviation fuel, and we're, of course, all going to have an electric car, and it's all going to be lovely, and we're going to replace our kitchens all the time just with lovely sustainable materials. So how do you present to people a positive view of the change in our actual lifestyles that we're going to need to make, which actually won't make us miserable? We know that, but people feel it's going to be hard and they're going to be penalised and lose out. So how do you talk to people about that?
Yes, not punitively. So the idea we're going to confiscate people's consumer benefits, as it were, and make everybody live a compulsory muesli-munching form of asceticism doesn't work well. I have been completely honest about this. Just Stop Oil's biggest mistake was when it decided to do its campaign against airports in the summer of last year, against people who turned up at the airport to take their flight to Malaga, whatever it might be, and were not many of the actions happened, of course, but when they did, to be confronted by Just Stop Oil, essentially, whether they meant to or not, saying to everybody, you're at fault here, you're guilty of getting on a plane to the south of Spain, or whatever. And for me, that was just bonkers. And compare that with what happened when Cole MacDonald and Jen went and sprayed private jets at Stansted. They didn't know, by the way, that Taylor Swift's private jet had just flown in. That was completely accidental. But they went and sprayed the private jets at Stansted. People bloody well loved it. Why? Because we all hate the fucking billionaires. So don't go after people. These lifestyle things are... We've got to work through this. And I think a lot of it is about increased simplicity in our lives, finding more reliance on the things that give people a genuine sense of solidarity, community spirit. I think it's possible, but it's not an easy one. Prove it in practice. There was an interesting thing about food waste today, because good journalists have been fossicking around in the great big food bins outside M&S stores, and they'd found all this horror story about M&S. And of course, somebody came on then from WRAP, which is the government-funded agency addressing food waste. And I did feel sorry for this guy, because obviously I can't remember which one it was that presented, wanted him to have a full-on attack on M&S for utterly wicked, depraved, wasteful behavior, and that's why M&S food costs so much. And he sort of said, well, yes, no, it does happen, it's not good, but the retail end of it is only 2% of the total food waste problem here in the UK. And in fact, far more food waste arises from people post-consumer waste in their homes. And then he dropped this little ping statistic, you know, the way experts can do, and said, you know, if everybody sort of thought a bit about that and were helped to work their way through food waste issues and challenges, because it's not easy, by the way, the saving would be £1,000. If we got on top of post-consumer food waste in the home, £1,000. Whoa, bloody hell. That's a lot. So, again, we have to think, my sort of instinct here is to start To start from the place where it doesn't make any sense and work out what you need to do with better narratives to make it make sense. God, that sounded clever. Very suspicious. Okay, one here, and then we're coming to you, I think. And I'm going to now take three together, and then I'm going to wrap it up. Yes.
Hi. Thank you very much for your talk. Fascinating. I'm really quite angry about everything. We are not allowed to protest, and if we do protest, then we get into prison for it. And at the same time, they're not listening to the science. So what can we do? And in my view, we can't do very much because they're stopping us. But then something happened in November when Mamdani won the New York election. And that was because he had approximately, well, they say over 130,000 volunteers going down everybody's door saying, please vote, please vote, please vote. And the only way to change government from Labour and Conservative and to get Green is for everybody to knock on doors.
Yes.
I mean, we've got to do something that wasn't done before.
Yes.
And how do we encourage that?
Well, guess what's coming up in May next year? Woohoo! So, as long as your name begins with Z, so Zach and Zara and Zoran, okay, representing the Zoomers, Gen Z, as long as your name begins with Z, you can go out and mobilize tens of thousands of people to go and knock doors. Look, I spent 3 months last year working for Green Party candidates in 2 of the constituencies that were eventually won by the Green Party, and boy, we knocked and knocked and knocked and knocked and knocked. And the number of volunteers eventually rose in the constituency I was working in Herefordshire North to 400 people. Now, that may not sound a lot, but I can tell you 400 people in Herefordshire North, whoa, which is a seriously remote rural constituency with a lot of footwork involved, that was pretty astonishing. And Ellie Chans, the Green Party MP there, would say, absolutely up front, we won this partly because the Tory MP was there before, was effectively a rotten borough MP, as in he never bothered to canvass because he never had any opposition. So he was completely thrown by the Green Party campaign on the ground, door by door, every single time. And that led to this momentum, so that as the campaign started and suddenly everywhere around the constituency, Green Party posters were there. There wasn't a single Tory poster. Why? Because that arrogant bastard, the outgoing Tory MP, never bothered. Because he thought, yeah, I've been MP here for 22 years. Obviously I'm going to be MP for another 5 years. No, you're not. You're out.
Do you think we'll forget by May?
No, I don't think we'll forget. No, I don't think we'll forget. I mean, look, I want politicians, and there's a lot that we could learn from the Lib Dems here. I'm trying to be kind and nice about the Lib Dems as well. But I think the Green Party, with now 175,000 members, I live in Cheltenham, we have 2 councillors. We have had, up until now, a pool, about 30 volunteers to go and knock on doors, quite hard work. Now our membership secretary is distraught because our membership has tripled and nobody quite knows what to do about this and how we're going to organize. And they're all coming in with huge expectations, of course, because they haven't joined for fun, they've joined to change the system. So, May's a good chance. Green Party has 800 councillors at the moment. My bet, after the May election, 5,000. Woo! You heard it first. I'm allowed to exaggerate. Okay, sorry, I said we were going to do one more here. Have I missed any hands completely? No.
Thank you,
Definitely
Jonathan.
the last one.
Thank you for your words of wisdom and for everything you've done over the years. George Monbiot wrote an article in The Guardian today which was very revealing about the fact that now foreign international corporations are taking the British government to court for keeping the coal in the ground from the Cumbria minefield. And this is happening in a court outside our country by foreign lawyers. and there doesn't seem to be much we can do about it. So it may follow that the same might happen with the Rosemount field. This is an impossible situation where we've actually got the government to keep the fuel in the ground, and now we're being claimed against by the very people who wanted to get out of the ground in the first place.
Yes, this has been going on for years, by the way. This is an international treaty that was signed up to by governments starting weirdly in the EU, but strongly backed by the USA, and then picked up by others, and it was all done in the name of promoting economic growth. So the idea was that you would make it easier for private sector interests to win permission, planning permission from governments if you introduce this new international treaty, binding international treaty. People are pulling out of that treaty now. The UK, of course, we don't like doing anything like that. But country after country is pulling out of the treaty. If this case, I haven't read George's article, by the way, today, I bet it's a blinder, but if this case becomes real against the UK government, even Starmer will pull out of that international treaty. And at that point, I think the treaty is going to die anyway, because more and more governments are saying, no, you can't do this. Okay, so thank you so much, everybody. Look, just one last word, if I may, because you probably saw as you came in a monstrous pile of books at the back, and thank you again to Clapham Books for coming along this evening. They will be very, very disappointed if they have to take any of them back to the bookshop. And I just want to say, if I may, about the book. So all the proceeds from the sales of this book are going to support radical civil disobedience and climate activism. Okay? That doesn't mean to say Clapham Books won't get their fair share. Don't worry, I could see you suddenly twitching at the back there. It costs 10 quid, and I do hope that you will be able to purchase the copy this evening, or possibly. Final thought, I'm a very active supporter of an organization called Presence with Purpose. Do not allow your purchasing power at Christmas to go into the pockets of people who market limitless tat, often manufactured outside of this country, which ends up in various waste streams on Boxing Day, or maybe a week later, if you're lucky, and is just a massive, abusive form of consumerism at its absolute worst. So Presence with Purpose, this is my organization, by the way, I've just made it up. Presence with Purpose is all about persuading people to give presents that may have some lasting effect. So my plug this evening, for those of you who haven't yet sorted out your Christmas presents, is maybe you want to buy 2 copies of the book, one for yourself and one for that person who you know most needs to read it. And if you're still wondering why you're going to buy 2 copies, some of you may be involved in Secret Santa exercises in your place of work. Obviously, this sorts it. So I'm making fun of it, but I do hope that you'll see the book and your opportunity to buy it tonight as a reason to support this kind of radical contribution to a better world. I can't put it more tellingly than that. So thank you very much for coming here this evening.